This is Duke University.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our December session of Fuqua Faculty Conversations. My name is Ashleigh Shelby Rosette. I'm a professor here at the Fuqua School of Business, and I am happy and excited to be here today. The format for today's session is very simple. It's just a Q&A based upon the pre-reading video that I hope that you had a chance to take a look at. You can submit your questions via Twitter using the hashtag Fuqua Alumni, so hashtag Fuqua Alumni. And before we get started, there are a couple of things that I'd like to do. First, I'd like to make an acknowledgement, and then second, I'd like to give you a friendly reminder. During the pre-reading video, I referenced some of my research, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge my collaborators. So the first paper that was published, Perceiving Social Inequity, that was done with my friend and colleague, Lee Toast. She's a former Fuqua PhD student, and she's currently on faculty at the University of Michigan. In addition, in that video, I acknowledged the camouflage effect and the work that was done with regards to in that series of work. And that collaborator, my collaborator for that work was Lee Thompson. She is on faculty at Northwestern University. So just as a brief reminder, I thought I would kind of give you a few highlights from the video with regards to some of my research. And the principal finding is that the idea that social hierarchies are interlocking and that no individual is extremely disadvantaged or extremely advantaged on all dimensions, but usually there's a multiple dimensions that are considered. And we suggest in our research that when you are disadvantaged or subordinate on one dimension, that can help or facilitate the extent to which you recognize your privilege on a different dimension. And something that wasn't necessarily highlighted in the video was this idea of success and how the true underlying meaning of success in the role of this recognition. So in the video, we highlight the experience of disadvantage, and that disadvantage spurs the extent to which we look around for explanations for our subordinated state. When we look around, we discover that we're disadvantaged. We note that we're disadvantaged. Automatically, we can see the disparity between us and others that are actually privileged on that same domain, on that similar domain. So with regards to women, they acknowledge their gender disadvantage. That allows them to see their male privilege, and then that allows them to perhaps recognize their racial privilege. And what we found in our research is that when you are socially subordinate on one group, socially dominant on another group, that this recognition only occurs or primarily occurs when you have experienced moderate success. Now, in the video, I said low success, and that's not exactly correct because in our study, most of the people in our study didn't necessarily perceive themselves as being less successful. They were on a scale from 1 to 7. The average mean was around 5. So there was high success and moderate success. And so we found that this occurred, this disadvantage linking to privilege, then linking to privilege on a different domain, only occurred or primarily occurred when the person was not or was minimally successful. And so that's kind of a very interesting finding because it suggests that when an individual is successful, that for a subordinate group member, that success may be a little bit tenuous. When we think about women who are successful, they frequently occupy, or they frequently are in a male-dominated industry or a male-dominated role, and so their success may be a little bit more tenuous than those people who are not in those types of positions. And the thing about that research that we found quite interesting was that in those series of 3 studies, in addition to finding that primary effect, there was something that kind of spurred our interest a little bit. And that was we saw that men who were not successful versus men who were successful, that there were some that basically in the first study, there was no difference in their acknowledgement of privilege. But in the second study, that men who were successful actually were more likely to acknowledge their white privilege with regards to race and their male privilege with regards to gender. Now, this wasn't the focus of this initial study. And because it was not the focus of the initial study, and because the findings weren't replicated, and because our focus was not on socially dominant gender and socially dominant race, but was on the intersection of the two, we suggested that we would look at this in future research. And so that then spurred the second set of studies, which is the new research that shows that the idea of being successful can be the circumstances under which a person is both most likely and least likely to recognize their privilege. And again, showing that when we expand the consideration of disadvantage to not just look at race or not just look at gender, because you can be disadvantaged on multiple categories, that's when we actually saw that the disadvantage or the recognition of disadvantage by those groups that were socially dominant and socially subordinate, then that's when they were, when they recognized all types of disadvantage, not just race and gender, that's when they were more likely to recognize their privilege when they were successful, and least likely to recognize that privilege when they were not successful. And that was compounded by the extent to which they also acknowledged that individual merit may or may not play a significant role in their success. So disadvantage and successful, highly recognizing privilege. And that effect was magnified when they also recognized the extent to which their success may have come about not just because of their individual merit and not just because of their hard work, but by other haphazard factors like luck and things of that nature. So I just kind of wanted to highlight the idea and the focus on success, and that success played one role in those first sets of studies when we looked at socially dominant groups on one domain and socially subordinate on a different domain. And then they played a different role with regards to when we were looking at those groups that were socially dominant on both their race and their gender. So some questions have started to come in, and before I answer these questions, I also want to give a reminder that I also gave at the beginning of the video, and that is I recognize that I am tackling topics that are frequently not easy to discuss. They provide us a great deal of discomfort sometimes. They can incite various tensions amongst us, and many people would avoid discussing them if they could. So I recognize the difficulty in discussing these topics, but just because they're difficult doesn't mean that we should not have these discussions, and it doesn't mean that we can't learn a whole lot from these discussions. It means that we have to talk about them delicately, we have to talk about them openly and honestly, but very respectfully. So first sets of questions that are here in front of me. So it looks like these first couple of questions can probably be asked together. And so because they both seem to tackle culture. So one person says, Dr. Rosette, have you also studied the effect of nationality and how different cultures impact social inequity? If yes, are there any factors unique to the United States versus other regions of the world? That was sent in by Steve, who graduated in 2003 and was part of our cross-continent program. Another question that's along those same domains says, great initiative, Professor. Thank you. He says, working for a diverse company has been a benefit and a challenge for me. Curious if there is a reason why Asian companies reserve the high executive positions for the natives of that country. This is submitted actually by Enrique Morales, who was one of my former students. He was in the 2011 Weekend Executive MBA program. And both of these questions highlight, I guess, a primary limitation of my work. For example, in my work and in the video, you see that I am a little bit critical in the fact that people tend to look at social inequity primarily as disadvantage and not as privilege. And so I would basically put myself in that category as having a very myopic view of the way in which I am also studying this topic, and that is it primarily, I am considering it within the context of the United States. With that, so I have not conducted my research with regards to other cultures, and so I can't really say with definitive research behind it in terms of answering this question. I can speculate in a little bit. And if I were to speculate, I would suggest that we'd probably be very hard-pressed to find any culture in contemporary societies across the world that don't have a level of social hierarchy of some sort. So for example, in certain cultures, like China and India, those hierarchical structures are very opaque, very apparent, and they are highlighted in the society. In other cultures, like that may be more egalitarian, there may be the extent to which these hierarchies are apparent maybe more muted, if you will. But nonetheless, social hierarchies likely occur in almost any society. Similarly, those social hierarchies may be based upon ascribed characteristics, meaning the characteristic or the status in which you were born into, or those status and characteristics about which you have no control, like your gender or your race. And there are also likely to be those status social hierarchies that are based upon individual merit. I think what culture would bring to this discussion is the extent to which one system camouflages the other may be influenced by the various cultural dynamics. So in one culture, with regards to those ascribed characteristics, they may mask the individual merit. In another culture, the individual merit may be more pronounced, and they may mask those ascribed systems of privilege and disadvantage. So I would suggest that in any culture where you have these various status hierarchies, that you're likely to see a recognition or a denial of privilege, and you're likely to see these various inequities play out. And so I would also suspect that perhaps your status on one subordinate, your status as a subordinate on one category could substantially influence the extent to which you were to recognize privilege on a distinct category. So my answer would be, I think that there definitely would be some cultural influences, but the extent that this may occur, I can't say with 100% conviction, because I haven't done the empirical research to answer those questions. So thank you very much for those couple of questions. Another question that I have here, it says, Dr. Rosette, I watched your video twice. Thank you for doing that. And both times I came away with the same question after you outlined what I considered to be obvious and unoriginal findings. So what? This person says. He says that social inequity has existed in nearly every human culture, Some people are privileged and others are not. In many cultures, the privileged have actively persecuted and suppressed the less privileged. In other cultures, like contemporary Western cultures, inequities are more subtle than wearing a burqa, being relegated to an inferior caste, or being able to acquire property or other legal rights. Is there any application to your research, or is it merely descriptive? Are you proposing any solutions, or are you just yet another individual stirring the pot without offering meaningful steps to remedy perceived problems? This question was submitted, he says, thanks. This question was submitted by Bill Cleveland, who is a daytime MBA and graduated in 1993. So, Bill, I would like to thank you for your questions. There are numerous questions in here. There are numerous aspects to this question that I agree with. Primarily that, yes, indeed, social inequity has been around for an extended period of time, and the idea that social inequity persists is not a new phenomenon. So I agree with that aspect of the question. In addition, I also agree with the aspect of this question that describes this as a perceived problem. That means that, Bill, you, like I, do identify many of the disparities that we see in our organizations and in our society at large as deriving not just from happenstance or from deserved merit, but instead they derive from things like bias and discrimination and injustice and unfairness that are built in our social systems. So I agree with you on that domain as well, Bill. I have to, however, disagree with you on a couple of domains. First, the question, is my research merely descriptive? Bill, my research is many things, but descriptive is not one of them. These are empirical findings that have been demonstrated using robust methods that are extremely rigorous, and the findings have been evaluated by a group of my peers who have determined that this research is of the caliber to be published in some of our top journals. So the research is many things, Bill, but it is not descriptive. The second question, which is a very good question, is that, are you proposing any solutions, or are you just yet another individual stirring the pot? I think stirring the pot is highlights, and using language like that highlights the tensions that can sometimes arise when we are talking about these types of topics, because stirring the pot indicates that I'm attempting to agitate in some way with my findings, and simply presenting my findings with regards to diversity, I don't find these to be agitating in any way. My attempt is simply to inform, to educate, and to perhaps even learn. So I'm not necessarily attempting to stir the pot. Now, you asked the ending part of that question is without offering any meaningful steps to remedy perceived problems. So in that regard, I would say let's start where we would like to go, okay? And Bill, based upon your question, you agree that there is social inequity, that there is disparity, and that there is an unfairness with regards to this, with regards to these various systems. And so that means that there is something out there that we would like to rectify and that we would like to make better. So then the question is, how then do we do that? Now, not my research, but existing research that has been done by my colleagues at Stanford says that you can continue to look at social inequity in the same way in which you have done, or in which we have done for years, as you have described here, and I think you said yes in terms of nearly every human culture. We can continue to look at it in the same way. And the same way that we usually look at it is in the context of disadvantage. And we say that with regards to social inequity, this group is disadvantaged. Now, we kind of wave our hands when we talk about the normative group to which that disadvantage is compared, right? But that normative group, which we sometimes think of, as just existing, out there, but that normative group is more than a comparison group. That normative group is exceptionally important, and we need to understand the dynamics of that norm. Now, what my colleagues out at Stanford have shown is that when we take these inequities, these disparities, that we would like to rectify, when we take these inequities and we frame them not as one person's disadvantage or not as one group's disadvantage, but instead we change the frame and we look at it with regards to that group's privilege, that's when the change actually comes about. When it's framed as disadvantage, it's usually that's somebody else's problem, or that the results that have led to this disparity are just and fair, and people just simply get what it is that they deserve. However, when we change the frame and we look at it within the context of privilege, that's when action occurs. That's when support for policies that attempt to rectify the inequity, that's when those things come about. So, and this bill is the new part of my research. So yes, these things have persisted, but the manner in which we have looked at them has been pretty consistent. And what my research says, and others have done, looked at this in various other domains as well, let's change the frame. If we change the frame, then that's when the difference will occur. So now let's back into my research and what I am saying. I'm simply trying to find the various ways that we can utilize in order to change the frame. And I'm simply saying that to continue to look at it from one way does not provide us a lot of insight and does not enact change. But instead to look at the interlocking aspect of multiple hierarchies, we get a better perspective. Because I think what happens, Bill, is that oftentimes we become ingrained in our opinions and our perspectives become the only perspectives that matter. We see this with regards to the current events that are happening in our world, in our society, and the protests. And that is when you see the talking heads that are on television, or when you see the demonstrations, they are demonstrating from their own perspectives and their own positions. And that can be somewhat limiting, and that does not enact change. What I am simply suggesting is that by considering alternative perspectives, we can better understand where people are coming from and recognize that inequities do persist, they do necessitate change, and looking at them in a different way can hopefully enact that change. Hope that answers your question, Bill. It looks like I have another question here. And this is from John Vague, who is in our Global Executive MBA program, who recently graduated in 2014. He says that as a Latino male who is multicultural, highly educated, white, upper class, Brazilian, and middle class American, your conclusions make total sense. Thanks, John. I appreciate that. Interestingly, I often find that members of the American corporate establishment would rather see me as a white Anglo and dislikes me raising these inequity issues as a Latino. So there's not a question that John poses here, but I'm very happy that he shared his perspective. So John, I think your summary here highlights a great deal. And I think you are someone who obviously values your multiple identities. This is something that's exceptionally important to you. But your colleagues, and this is frequently the case when we think about these issues, are probably more comfortable extracting a colorblind or color race or color class or whichever dimension that you could choose here, are more likely comfortable operating in a colorblind society. And I think for some that it's highlighting how difficult it can be to tackle these topics. It's simply not easy to discuss them. So most people, as opposed to doing what makes them uncomfortable, they would choose not to engage in these types of discussions at all. And to their defense, John, I think that frequently it's because some people have a true curiosity and they want to engage in these conversations, but frequently they just simply don't know how. They don't know how to talk about these very divisive topics, because perhaps in the past they have learned that when they bring these topics up, that if they are not framed in the right way, that they may be perceived as insensitive. They may extract defensive responses from individuals, and as a result, it's just easier to remain quiet as opposed to engage in these conversations. And so for you, John, I would suggest that one of the things that you should consider is letting people know that it's okay to have these conversations. Oftentimes, I advise people that you have to disarm these topics, meaning take the toxicity out, take the defensiveness out, in order to have a fruitful conversation. So, John, if these are things that are important to you and that you would like to discuss in your organizational settings, I think you have to give people the okay, the okay signal, that it is okay for them to speak honestly and to speak earnestly. And you should also have to recognize that sometimes when people say and they talk about these things, that they're going to say some things that you're going to fundamentally disagree with, and you have to respect their opinions, just like you are asking them to respect yours. So I really like to highlight in my research is that it really is a two-way street. And if you want people to understand your perspective, you really have to understand theirs, or at least attempt as well as you can to understand these perspectives. I think the problem, though, comes about when we simply don't have these conversations and they just kind of, go under the rug. When they go under the rug, they don't go away. We have events that are in our current social milieu, in our current news cycle, that shows that these things may remain dormant, but then something happens that triggers a reaction, and then you recognize that those things that were just piling up under the rug, they're released, and they're released in a very a huge and traumatic way. So, John, I'm glad to hear that these things make sense, and if these are things that are important to you in terms of bringing your social identity at work, bring your social identity to work, and you'd like to engage in these topics, let people know that it's okay, that you're open to multiple perspectives in this way. But recognizing people fundamentally don't like change. They don't like to engage in those topics that make them make them uncomfortable. But it can be worthwhile when we do, and be extremely insightful when we do tackle those tough topics. All righty. We have Alex Goolsby, who is another one of my former students, a Weekend Executive 2010. Hi, Alex. How are you? I recognize your name here. Alex says, some groups aim to leverage disadvantages. Women's networks, LGBT affinity groups. Any evidence of how or if this is effective? Alex, I guess my question to you is, I would really want to know, when you say leverage a disadvantage, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that they want to make people aware of the disadvantages from which they experience? Or do you mean leverage it in terms of trying to get something out of it, if you will? And so in either instance, I think that there probably is some evidence out there, but I guess the question that I would have to consider is why do these organizations or why do these entities exist? Why is it necessary to have a women's network, or why is it perceived necessary to have an LGBT affinity group? And I think this question kind of works in tandem with the question from John, and that is people have identities. People have things that represent them that they perceive to be important. And women, when they come to work, they don't leave their gender identity at home. When our LGBT community, if they are out, they have chosen not to leave their heterosexual sexual orientation identity at home. That is, they bring these identities to work. In fact, oftentimes, if you were to ask a person, you know, what represents you? Many people will say, well, I'm a woman, I am gay, I am black, I am Christian, I am Hindu, I am Muslim, I am old, I am short. And so these identities are exceptionally important for them. And so to say that you can't discuss this or that you have to not consider this can be somewhat handicapped. It can handicap the person in terms of the extent to which they can be the best professional that they can in the entity in which they operate. So organizations recognize this and they create these types of groups because it says that I value your identity, I value your difference, and I want to give you the space to be able to come together with people who also value that type of identity. So the purpose of these groups is that people recognize that diversity is important, they recognize that these identities are important, and they also perhaps recognize that these identities have been subordinated in some way. And so when we ask the question, some groups aim to leverage their disadvantage, I think first, the purpose of these groups is to bring these groups together. And the purpose may be to perhaps highlight that they are different from those majority members in the organization. So when we say leverage disadvantage, meaning do they want to gain something from it? They probably want to have people to gain awareness about that they exist and this is an identity that's exceptionally important to them. But with regards to gaining, other types of rewards or benefits just because they occupy this particular social category, I'm not necessarily sure that occurs. But but you could probably argue if the presumption is that there has been some inequity based upon these social categories, then they're probably not trying to leverage the disadvantage. They're probably just trying to make equitable what has been inequitable with regards to their own perceptions. So thanks, Alex, for that question. Let's see, we have another question here, and this is from Kylie Barnett. She doesn't give, her affiliation, but she said, could you further explain the multiplier effect on individual merit for those with unearned advantages? Sure, Kylie. So I'd probably take my colleague who is at Rutgers, and she spent several years doing multiple interviews with regards to people, specifically, primarily with regards to people, white males. Okay, and she also looked at numerous individuals, but white males was her focus. And in her research, Kylie, she took narratives. So she talked to several hundreds of individuals, and she talked to them for an extended period of time. And for I think if I recall correctly, the length of the interviews are roughly about 2 to 2.5 hours. So she spent a great deal of time with these individuals. And in the initial part of the interview, she would ask them, to what do you attribute your success? And there was usually some, very motivating story about, how they overcame adversity and worked very hard and worked very diligently and were committed and had a goal, and they didn't stop sight of that goal. Kylie, that's a very individual merit type of explanation in terms of it is me, it is mine, it is my accomplishments that that I did, and I worked hard. Now, Kylie, what she also found, what my colleague also found in these interviews, is that maybe an hour and a half, or into the interview, they would go back into their experiences and their childhood. And how'd you get your first job? Well, a friend, kind of put me. I knew a friend, and that friend found a job for me in the mailroom. Or, I had a little bit of trouble with the law, but, we kind of got that expunged, and so that didn't necessarily hinder me, but, but I worked really hard. Okay. Now, there are two things that are happening here in this single interview that my colleague, in this one interview, numerous times that my colleague did in her research, identified in her research, and that is there is indeed an aspect of individual merit, that these people perceive themselves to be successful and they work very hard. But there is also a point in their lives where things could have gone one way versus the other way. But because they had a connection, because of their category of membership, that things went the right way for them, so to speak. So Kylie, what my colleague found was that over the years, as the people worked hard, they started in the organization, they moved up in the organization, that the extent to which they accounted their success based upon their own individual merit was magnified. And the extent to which they attributed their success to these other things that are affiliated with their category of membership were minimized. And so had you perhaps captured these individuals at time zero, and both of these things are occurring, or basically, things went kind of wrong here, but now they're changing their life around, perhaps there have been, more of an equal recognition of these two systems working in tandem. But the longer you have been in an organization, the longer you have been in your career, the more accolades you accumulate, that individual merit becomes more magnified, and those unearned advantages that may be associated with your category of membership become more minimized, so to speak. So that's kind of what I mean. And you could take any type of category of membership that has an unearned advantage and probably utilize it in that way, because it doesn't become, it's not salient anymore. It's kind of like the example that I provided in the video, and that is when you sit at the front, when you sit in the front row for an extended period of time, maybe when the teacher initially, creates the system, you see that, there are, other people that because you are sitting in the front row, that unearned advantage allows you some benefit. But I think, the more you sit in the front row, the more you throw that ball of paper into the garbage can again and again and again, then the people in the back row just become more muted if you don't have a reason to turn around and look at the people in the back row. Okay. So I think that we are attempting to wrap up with regard, nope, we have more questions. All right, so I don't have any questions in front of me. I can't tell if that's lack of interest or you're so interested in that I'm answering all of your questions that you're not generating any additional questions. But I think that my team over here tells me that, they are writing, so there is a question that's coming up here. So for those of you who have submitted your questions, thank you so much. I think that we are having an insightful and fruitful conversation, and I am exceptionally appreciative of your interest in this topic and your very thoughtful questions. And also great to reconnect with some of my former students. Hey, it's great to see that you are out there, and great to reconnect with you in this particular way. All right, looks like it's here. This is going to be a doozy. We'll see what happens. This is from Joy Guren. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Joy, and if I'm not, I apologize. Daytime 2011. Joy asked the question, are there studies that explore the actions that best address corporate inequities related to performance and advancement? So I ask because I find that often corporate affinity groups and other programs are focused on training those in disadvantaged groups to conform to the norms of those in advantaged groups, rather than training those in advantaged groups to broaden their perspective on what are strengths versus weaknesses. Are there examples of companies out there who are approaching this differently? Joy, to be honest, I'm not sure. I would agree that the idea is usually, around assimilation than it is acculturation. But nonetheless, assimilation versus basically the idea is that the disadvantaged groups, should kind of conform to what is normative, as opposed to us really broadening and really having a multicultural perspective here. And so I would agree with that. And your experience, as you are outlining it here in your organization, would be consistent with my research. So are there other examples that are taking this alternate route and framing their diversity sessions and their diversity training on the privileged groups? I don't know, to be honest. I hope that there are. I think that can be maybe extremely enlightening to do so. I do know, Joy, that there is kind of a groundswell now around implicit bias and attempting to understand implicit bias. So many organizations are bringing in experts. They are designing seminars. They are really harnessing and embracing this idea of implicit bias. And implicit bias just simply means that we possess these various types of biases that may not be explicit in nature. So you may not have, explicit prejudice, and you may not intend to discriminate. But nonetheless, because of the way in which we have been housed in society, we're simply too exposed to these various images that stereotype one group versus another. And whether we intend to or not, then we internally process those stereotypes, and we make decisions related to those stereotypes. And this idea has really taken on a great deal of reflection, or many organizations have taken on this idea and have reflected upon it. And I think it's probably the closest thing that we've seen in the context of looking at things in a new and different way, and actually seeing people and organizations embracing these ideas. Because it says, I think the thing that implicit bias does is it takes the defensiveness out of the discussion of prejudice and discrimination and stereotypes, because people, it clearly shows that these people can have low prejudice attitudes in terms of their overt intention. So they don't intend to discriminate, they don't intend to be prejudiced, but nonetheless they do it because of these various images and the way in which society displays these various groups. And so, Joy, I think that's the closest thing that we've seen, and we've really seen a surge in the study of implicit bias with regards to our academic settings, and most importantly with regards to various corporate clients embracing these ideas. So I hope that helps a little bit, Joy. John Vague, who is Gimba 2014. I think we've heard from John before, so thanks, John, for chiming in again. He says, it seems critical to educate both the advantaged and the disadvantaged to ensure when individuals rise the social ladder, they will not mistreat others below them. Please comment on research, on this. And so I think, John, you are right, and I hope that I have highlighted that I think it is incumbent on us to look at both sides of this coin and not a single side of this coin. John, I would probably say the space that has gotten the most attention of the idea that when a specific disadvantaged member or a subordinate group member climbs the corporate ladder, so to speak, and then mistreats those beneath them. There's something called the queen bee syndrome that has been studied within the context of gender and has shown that sometimes when women matriculate up the organizational setting and when they are perhaps in very low numbers or perhaps even the only individual, then they that occupies that group, so they're perhaps the only woman, then they perceive that there is room for only women and only one woman, and instead of looking back to help those behind them that may perhaps be experiencing the same adversity that they may have experienced in terms of reaching to the top. Instead of reaching out a hand, instead they reach out a foot and stomp and push them back. And so there is an extensive amount of research on the queen bee syndrome. Not an extensive amount, but there is some amount of research that suggests, John, that this does occur. And there are various, reasons for the queen bee syndrome. Some of it has to do with the idea of, I want to be the only one. That's where the queen bee connotation comes from. Another thing is that oftentimes when people have worked hard, there's a double standard of competence. This is Fauci's research, and when people have to work twice as hard to get half as far, then they basically presume that other people should also have to do that in terms of working up the ladder, and so they attempt to make it just as hard for them because they need to earn their stripes, so to speak. There's also this aspect of collective identity, and that is I'm only going to pull back and help those individuals that are going to represent our identity in the our identity in the best way possible. So, for example, if perhaps a queen bee or someone who's in that top role perceives that there's someone who's coming behind her and she does not exemplify, or she's not, a superstar in some way. She may choose not to help that particular person because that person's inclusion into the category may diminish the extent to which people think highly of that category. So yes, I guess, John, I should say that there's quite a bit of research that looks at this particular phenomenon within the context of gender. I'm sure there's other research out there within other domains. I'm just a little bit more familiar with queen bee syndrome because that's where this phenomenon has taken place. And I also have actually two really good colleagues that kind of show the conditions under which you're more likely to reach back as opposed to push down. And so they've done some really good work in that domain as well. So yes, I wholeheartedly agree with you, John, that indeed it is critical to educate both sides of the coin. And the other thing, John, also that kind of goes into this phenomenon is that the extent to which people identify with the social groups to which they belong. So, for example, earlier I said, some people, they wholeheartedly identify with their gender group as women, or they wholeheartedly identify with their gender group as Hispanic, or they wholeheartedly, identify with their gender group as gays. Other people simply don't. And they don't want to be defined by that category. And that is, if you ask them what are your top 5 ways in which you identify yourself, even though they may be a woman, that may be the 10th thing on their list. And so therefore they don't want to highlight that identity. And so instead of trying to, and they may overcorrect in the opposite way. So instead of just being neutral, they may actually overcorrect and hinder the advancement of other people who share that identity. So I hope that's helpful for you. All righty. We have another question, and this is from Roxanne Stafford, who graduated. She was a part of our daytime MBA program, who graduated in 2010. And she's asked the question, what can we do in our workplaces to promote these types of conversations? That's tough, Roxanne. I think the onus is on us to start these types of conversations. I think in our organizational settings, I know when I was a CPA, and obviously my willingness to engage in these types of conversations has changed quite a bit over the years, but I understand what the corporate environments can be like sometimes, and it can be very difficult to let conversations continue without identifying without clearly identifying opportunities for enlightenment, so to speak. So for example, if you are in your organization and someone, makes a stereotype about a different group, do you let that go, or do you speak out about it? Other research that I have done says that there are conditions under which, people will choose to let that go, or there are conditions under which people choose to speak out about it. And my research shows that, it's basically, the extent to which you perceive that some groups are more deserving than others, that social inequality should persist. So, Roxanne, I would say for you, look for opportunities that in your workplace where conversations can take place. But also recognizing, Roxanne, that sometimes when we initiate these conversations, that we are going to be perceived differently for doing so. We can't help it. As we saw from one of the previous questions, change makes people uncomfortable. Challenge makes people uncomfortable. And sometimes when we challenge these ideas, we may be labeled in a way that is not beneficial to us. And now this isn't fair, but this is just reality. So Roxanne, when you ask the question, what can we do in our own workplaces to promote these types of conversations? Find people who are willing to have these conversations with you. I fundamentally believe in the idea of coalitions, and that is, if A and B are willing to talk, and A, B, and C are willing to talk to C, A, B, C, and D are then willing to talk, and together they go to E. And then they, as a collective, can talk to E, about something that may be exceptionally important to them. So the idea of first finding people who are likely to want to have these conversations, and recognizing, Roxanne, that it's sometimes easy to look to those people who are most similar to you, but oftentimes people who are different from you may also be willing to have these conversations, and to show the diversity amongst individuals who want to have this conversation, I think will minimize the detriment or the disadvantages that can come about when you bring these topics up. Because usually, let's say that, with regards to race, if it's only, Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Asians who are having the conversation or who want to have the conversation, then it's maybe somewhat easy to dismiss it. So that means that a racial conversation should include all races, and that means the normative group to which the races are compared. So having whites in that conversation as well, and collectively, right, you come together and say, this is a conversation that is important to us, then it can be a little bit more palatable when you attempt to have those with a more broader audience in your organization. And the same thing with regards to gender. When it's only, women who are saying this is important to us, then people can easily dismiss it as a woman issue. But when you have women and men together saying, no, this is an issue that is important to us, I want to discuss it, that can be exceptionally important. So one, build coalitions with regards to people who want to have this conversation, and strategically build those coalitions with an eye on diversity. All right. So I am getting the signal that I should wrap up. The time has passed by exceptionally fast, even with a little window of waiting for questions. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I encourage you, if you'd like to continue the dialogue, feel free to send me an email. I'm always happy to talk about my research. Trust me, researchers love to talk about our research, so I'm happy to share in those conversations. I want to remind you that we will have some new Fuqua Faculty Conversations taking place in 2015, and to be on the lookout for additional information about those conversations. Thank you so much. That's my time. Have a fantastic day. Bye.